When we bought the house, we knew about the cemetery next door. It was one of those old properties with a charm you just don't find in modern buildings anymore. Of course, the price was great, which helped us make the decision. The view of the tombstones didn't bother me. In fact, I found it kind of poetic. I saw the place as a symbol of peace, the end of a cycle, and maybe that comforted me in some way. To my husband, the cemetery was just another insignificant detail. In the first few days, everything was wonderful. The house had that smell of old wood, and the sunlight streamed through the windows in a way that felt almost cinematic. We spent our mornings unpacking boxes, and in the afternoons, we allowed ourselves to enjoy the quiet, sipping coffee on the porch, watching the trees gently swaying in the breeze. It was the start of a new chapter, and everything seemed perfect. However, from the very first night, something inside me felt off. It wasn't exactly fear, at least not a clear fear. It was more like a sense of unease, as if I was being watched when no one was around. I tried to brush it off. After all, there were so many changes happening, so many emotions involved, it was only natural to feel a little unsettled. I was in a new home, next to a cemetery. That required some adjustment. One night, as we were finishing up organizing the living room, my husband looked out the window. He made a joke about the quiet neighbors outside, referring to the tombstones. We laughed together, but the laughter caught in my throat. I knew I was being irrational, but the joke bothered me. Maybe it was because, deep down, I wasn't entirely comfortable with how close we were. But, as usual, I swallowed the discomfort and moved on. The first few nights in the house were peaceful, with nothing major happening. The only thing I noticed was the absolute silence that fell with the night. It was a kind of silence I had never experienced before. There were no sounds of passing cars, not even the chirping of crickets. Just oppressive silence, occasionally broken by a distant creak or the rustling of leaves in the trees. I convinced myself that this was all part of the charm of the place. It's just a matter of getting used to it, I kept telling myself. But deep down, something was bothering me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on yet. On the third night, something woke me up. It wasn't a noise nor a bad dream. I just woke up with the feeling that I needed to look out the window. The room was draped in shadows, with only the faint light of the moon filtering through the curtains. I tried to ignore the impulse, but the sense of unease was growing. I turned over in bed, trying to fall back asleep, but something was pulling me out from under the covers, like someone or something wanted me to see what was outside. Reluctantly, I got up. I walked to the window, and with trembling hands, I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek out at the cemetery. That's when I saw it. There was someone outside, standing among the tombstones. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that it was just a shadow or a tree swaying in the wind. But as I focused more, I realized the figure was completely still. It looked like a person standing there, staring directly at our house. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to make out more details, but the distance and darkness made it difficult. Could it be a visitor? Someone mourning a loved one? That would make sense, but who would visit a cemetery at that hour of the night? Logic told me it was unlikely, and yet there it was. I watched for a few minutes, trying to find an explanation. The figure remained unmoving, like a statue among the gravestones. My thoughts were racing. Finally, I looked away, closed the curtain, and crawled back into bed, feeling strangely exposed. My heart was pounding, but I didn't want to wake my husband. That would be ridiculous, right? The next morning, I told him what I saw. He laughed and said it was probably someone visiting the cemetery, someone who just needed a moment of peace. "You're overthinking it," he said, trying to reassure me. I wanted to believe him, but something inside me kept nagging. A small voice whispering that there was more to that figure than I was willing to admit. The days passed, and I tried to convince myself that what I saw that night was nothing more than a misunderstanding. My husband was right, I was overreacting. But even with the conscious effort to ignore what had happened, I couldn't. Every night, I felt compelled to look out the window, and each time I did, my heart sank a little deeper. The figures were still there. It wasn't always the same figure, at least I don't think so. Sometimes it seemed like a masculine silhouette, other times it was shorter, slender, almost fragile. But no matter the shape, they were always there, silently watching. The only thing that never changed was the fact that they were facing our house, motionless as if waiting for something. I began to notice small sounds at night. At first, It was just occasional creaks, like the sound of old wood adjusting to the cold of the early morning. Then came the footsteps, light, spaced steps as if someone was walking outside the house, circling the walls. On certain nights, the sound was so clear that I forced myself to get up and go to the door, but of course there was nothing there. Not even footprints in the soft dirt around the house. My mind started to unravel. I began sleeping poorly, with a constant feeling that something was watching me. The worst part was that my husband seemed completely oblivious to all of it. He slept soundly every night with no signs of discomfort. I wondered how it was possible that he didn't notice anything. It made me question whether I was becoming paranoid, if it was all just in my head. The figures, the noises, the feeling of being watched, everything was becoming unbearable. I tried talking to my husband again, but he kept laughing, suggesting I was exaggerating or that the exhaustion from the move was affecting my sleep. But I knew. I could feel that there was something very wrong with that cemetery, something that, in some way, was getting closer and closer to me. That night I woke up again. The silence in the house was so profound it seemed to have weight, suffocating. I turned over in bed, feeling a chill run through my body. This time, what woke me wasn't the sound of footsteps or the occasional creaks. It was whispers. Low, almost imperceptible, as if they were coming from far away, carried by the wind. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, trying to figure out where they were coming from. The sound was strange, like multiple voices whispering at once, but without forming any understandable words. The chill down my spine intensified. I knew something was wrong. Even as the fear grew, I got up, pulled by a force I couldn't explain. I walked to the window, and as I drew back the curtain, I felt my heart stop. Outside, in the cemetery, there were more figures than before. They stood among the tombstones as usual, but this time there were many of them. They almost formed a circle, like a silent vigil, all of them facing our house. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. Then one of the figures moved. It wasn't a sudden movement, but slow, methodical, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. The figure advanced, step by step, toward our house. I wanted to scream, to call out to my husband, but no sound would come out. Fear had paralyzed me. As that thing walked, the whispers grew louder, as if they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. All I felt was a rising panic. Finally, I managed to turn and run to the bed. I shook my husband hard, trying to wake him. He didn't move. I kept calling his name, but it was as if he was in too deep a sleep to be disturbed. My heartbeat echoed in the silence of the room, and the whispers outside didn't stop. Desperate, I glanced back at the window. The figure was now nearly in front of the house, right by the door. I knew that wasn't a normal person. I knew something was very, very wrong. The next morning, I told my husband everything. I talked about the figures, the whispers, and how he just wouldn't wake up no matter how hard I tried. He looked at me with a concerned expression, but quickly masked it with a gentle smile. "You must be exhausted," he said. "The move, the stress, it messes with your head." He tried to reassure me, telling me I had been dreaming, that all of this was just a nightmare. But I knew that wasn't true. The whispers still echoed in my mind, like a continuous murmur I couldn't turn off. As the days went by, I began to feel increasingly isolated. It was as if I lived in a world apart, where only I could see what was happening. The figures didn't disappear. In fact, they were closer now, even during the day. I could see them in the shadows of the trees, among the gravestones, always lurking, always watching. Every night, the whispers returned. Sometimes, it was just a distant sound, like the wind passing through the leaves, but on other nights, they were so clear that I felt they were inside the house, right next to my ear. I started sleeping poorly, waking up multiple times during the night, always with that feeling of being watched. I tried telling my husband again, but he was becoming more distant. When I finally convinced him to look out the window with me, he saw nothing. "It's all in your head," he'd say. "You need to rest." But how could I rest with those figures always out there, with those voices calling to me, whispering things I couldn't understand? The worst part was the growing fear that something terrible was going to happen. I didn't know what the figures wanted, but I felt they were waiting for the right moment to do something I couldn't stop. And the fact that my husband couldn't see or hear what was happening made me feel even more desperate. I was alone in this terror, isolated even from the person I loved most. With each passing day, the presence of the figures became more oppressive, and the constant whispering rooted itself deeper in my mind. I knew something terrible was coming. The only question was, when? That night, the terror finally manifested itself in its most horrifying form. I woke to a loud noise, a sharp thud that echoed throughout the house. My heart raced in my chest even before I opened my eyes. I knew it wasn't an ordinary sound. I shot out of bed in a state of panic and ran to the window. As I pulled back the curtain, what I saw made my blood run cold. The figures were all gathered, much closer to the house than ever before. They were no longer scattered among the gravestones. Now they were right there in front of our door. A line of dark silhouettes, motionless, staring directly at the entrance. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. They seemed ready to come inside. My whole body trembled. I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. Desperate, I ran to the bed and shook my husband with all the strength I had. "Wake up. Please wake up," I begged. But he didn't react. His eyelids didn't even twitch. It was as if he was trapped in some deep, unbreakable sleep. I kept calling for him, pulling his arms, trying to snap him out of it. Nothing worked. He simply wouldn't wake up. My hands were sweaty, fear overtaking me. I glanced back at the window and the figures were still there. Now the sound of knocking echoed through the house. At first, the knocks were soft, almost like a patient insistence, but they quickly grew stronger, rhythmic, as if demanding that I let them in. With the knocking growing louder, panic consumed me. I didn't know what to do. I could stay there waiting for the figures to force their way in, or I could face them. Something inside me told me I had no choice. Somehow, I knew that if I didn't open the door, they would find another way in. They were all around us, closing in. I made the decision I never thought I would make. With heavy steps and my heart racing, I walked to the front door. The knocking continued, impatient, almost deafening now. My hands shook so badly I could barely grasp the doorknob. I knew that opening the door would bring something terrible, but at the same time, it felt like something was compelling me to do it. I took a deep breath and with a swift motion I turned the knob. The door creaked open and in that instant the figures outside entered. One by one they slipped past me, gliding into the house like shadows. They didn't look at me. They simply filled the space, the air growing thick with their oppressive presence. They were everywhere, surrounding me, and the last thing I felt was a deep, overwhelming cold that seeped into the room. I woke with the weight of something invisible pressing down on my chest. The room was bathed in a dim light, but the silence was as oppressive as the night before. I looked around, trying to understand where I was, what had happened, but everything felt confusing, hazy, like a dream I couldn't wake from. My husband slept soundly beside me, breathing calmly, completely unaware of the chaos that had settled within me. The figures. I was sure they had been there. They had entered our home, crossed the threshold like cold shadows. But now, everything seemed normal, quiet, as if nothing had happened. Yet deep down, I knew something had changed forever. I got out of bed, my legs trembling, and walked into the living room where the figures had come in. The air was still, heavy, as if the space still carried their presence. The curtains swayed slightly, and for a moment I thought I heard that sound again, the whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there, in the background, like a distant echo that refused to fade. I tried to tell my husband what had happened, but he looked at me with the same concerned expression he had shown before. "You need to rest," he said, his voice soft and soothing. "It's just your mind, you're exhausted." "No," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "I saw them. They were here. They came inside." He sighed, trying to calm me. "Honey, no one came in. The door is locked, the windows are shut. You're imagining things. You need to relax." But it was useless. No matter how much he tried to convince me that it was all in my head, I knew the truth. It was real. They were real. The day passed slowly, a blur of mundane routines, but my mind was adrift, always returning to the night before, to the shadows that had invaded our home. During the day, the sunlight felt almost safe, as if I could try to forget, but as night approached, the sense of dread crept back, crawling up like poison. When darkness fell over the house again, the atmosphere shifted. Everything felt colder, heavier. It was as if the very air was saturated with an invisible presence. I knew this night would be no different from the ones before, but something inside me feared it would be worse. And then the whispers returned. At first they were like a light breeze, almost a sound of wind, but soon they grew louder, clearer, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I was in the living room when I heard them for the first time. I moved toward the window, unable to resist the urge to look outside. And that's when I saw them. The figures were there again, but this time there were more of them, as if they had brought reinforcements. They were scattered throughout the cemetery, but something was different. They weren't just standing still. Some of them were moving now, slowly toward the house. My heart raced and I backed away from the window, breathing hard. I ran to the bedroom, trying once again to wake my husband, but it was the same as before. He was in a deep, unreachable sleep. My attempts to shake him were futile. It was as if he were in a trance, completely immersed in a dream from which he couldn't wake. Panic set in. Alone, surrounded by these shadows outside, I knew something terrible was about to happen. The knocking began again, echoing through the house like a sentence. It came from all directions, from the door, the walls, the windows. It was as if the figures were surrounding the entire house, demanding entry. This time I didn't go to the door. I ran down the hallway trying to find a place to hide. The sound of the knocking grew louder, more insistent. And then the front door began to creak as if it were being forced open. I felt the terror escalate, my body trembling as I huddled in a dark corner, unsure of what to do. The knocking stopped, replaced by a deadly silence. The air felt denser and I could barely breathe. Then the whispers intensified, so close now, so clear. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. Slowly I turned my head toward the hallway, and there, among the shadows, I saw what I feared most. One of the figures was inside the house. It didn't move, it just watched me with eyes I couldn't see but whose presence I could feel. The air around it was thick, suffocating, and in that moment I knew I was completely at its mercy. Fear overwhelmed me and silent tears streamed down my face. Everything inside me told me that no matter what I did, there was no escaping this. That night I finally understood. The figures weren't just waiting. They were hunting, and I was the prey.